Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Robin Ferrand. I'm a filmmaker and photographer based on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And today we're going to talk about this little cinema camera I have right here. This is the Canon R5C. It's going to be a long review, so get comfortable. I've owned the Canon R5C for about a year and a half now, and it's been my main camera since. And I've used it to shoot corporate and commercial projects, documentaries, travel videos, and of course as my daily photo camera. But now that the honeymoon period kind of phased out, what are my thoughts on this peculiar camera that Canon announced in January 2022? And I remember reading about the announcement in the taxi to the Vancouver airport. I was on my way to shoot a project for Travel Alberta, which ironically was going to be shot on the R5. Initially, it looked like Canon had simply slapped a bulky fan on the back of the R5 to resolve the dreadful overheating issue, and also to enable users to record 8K 60p RAW internally with a catch. And this seemed enough to rebrand this Frankenstein R5 as a brand new addition to the Canon cinema line. Initially priced at $4,499, it was $600 more than the R5. And the R5C was to be a true hybrid made for filmmakers that still wanted a powerful stills camera. Speaking of stills, the R5C features the same 45 megapixel CMOS full-frame sensor with the dual pixel autofocus for eye, face, and head detections for humans and animals like cats and dogs, and also has a mode to track vehicles, the same way the R5 does. You can shoot up to 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and up to 20 frames per second with the electronic shutters, as long as you have the proper media card and an LP6NH battery. And finally, the ISO range goes from 50 to 51,000 and is expandable to something like 100,000. But the main takeaway is that they removed the IBIS, which is the in-body image stabilization. Since the Canon R5C is first and foremost a cinema camera, this is where most of the change will occur. Starting with one of the most striking features, a new power button here on top that allows you to switch between photo and video mode. Because unlike other mirrorless, the R5C has two separate operating systems, or OS. The Photo OS is the equivalent to the R5. However, the OS for the video is comparable to what you would find on a Canon camera such as the C70. But the main selling point for the R5C is the internal unlimited recording of 8K 60p in the 12-bit RAW Canon Cinema RAW lights, which is quite exciting to see in such a compact camera. Of course, there is a catch though. The camera requires an external power supply to allow this recording mode, so 8K 60p. But you can still use the internal batteries to record up to 8K 30p for about 10 minutes, but more on this later. And I would say that the last noteworthy features is adding the XF AVC codec to the R5C. This is the first time that Canon has added this compact yet powerful codec to a mirrorless, and it's awesome. And for the rest of the characteristic, I'll be brief because this information has been shared many times, but in short, the R5C has a dual native ISO at 800 and 3200, 4K slow motion up to 120 frames per second with an audio recording into a separate WAV file. You can shoot in HDR, C-Log3, PQ, LHD formats. Of course, all of those are unlimited recording mode. No overheating. And then all of the cinema EOS functions, such as like waveform, false color, time code, all of those goodies. It has 13 customizable buttons, and it's Netflix approved if this means anything for you. So here's the thing, I didn't expect my R5C to arrive so early. So in the meantime, I purchased a used R6 to cover the few upcoming shoots I had. And then a few days later, the R5C arrived. So within a week, I went from the Canon R with a 30 megapixel sensor to the R6 with a 20 megapixel sensor, and then the R5C with the 45 megapixel sensor. I always thought that anything between 24 to 30 megapixel was a sweet spot for a digital camera. And the R6 is great, but sometimes 20 megapixel feels a little bit too short, especially if you're going to crop your images a lot. On the other hand, 45 megapixel can sometimes feel quite overwhelming. This is of course mandatory to enable the 8K recording, and in the world of like landscape photographers or even Sony shooters, well, 45 megapixel, it's old news and it almost became a standard. But it is still a lot of pixels, and don't get me wrong, I love how detailed the images are on the R5C, especially when paired with one of the RF lenses. However, since I shoot a lot of 35mm film, my eyes kind of got used to the softness of analog images. But I do enjoy the extra resolution when I shoot wildlife or faraway subjects, for example, because I can really crop into my images without losing too many details. And the raw files are around 60 megabytes, so I don't find them particularly large or difficult to work with. But then when it comes to image quality, there isn't anything else to say really. I mean, digital camera have become so good these past years. They all have excellent dynamic range, the resolution is amazing, great autofocus, so it's hard to find them default or even to set them apart. On that note, it's also great that camera manufacturers finally stopped that megapixel race they took a few years ago, except maybe Fujifilm, which I think they just simply didn't get the memo. One aspect that has always drawn me to Canon cameras over other brands is their constant work regarding camera ergonomics. When it comes to digital cameras, I don't think anyone does it better than Canon, with maybe Nikon being right behind. I've used my fair share of photo cameras from Nikon, Canon, Panasonic, Leica, Sony, but one thing that manufacturers often overlook is how comfortable their camera should be to hold and manipulate. From the size of the grip to the arrangement of the buttons, the quality of the viewfinders, and finally the design of the menu system, that's also a big thing. When mirrorless arrived on the market, we welcomed their smaller size and weight compared to the standard DSLR. And it's the same story with the lenses. I mean, manufacturers are always trying to develop smaller lenses, but without sacrificing the quality. And Sony in particular is really good at making quality compact lens. But for some reason, Canon doesn't seem to care about the size of their RF lenses. I mean, we saw it first with the beautiful 28-70 f2, and even more recently with that new beast, the RF 24-105 f2.8. And yeah, I guess, why make a compact lens when you can borrow the look of a 42-pounder Canon? The R5C followed the same design as the R5, so it has the same comfortable grip and the same extended viewfinder. Except now there is this kind of bulky fan in the way. So it makes shooting with the EVF less pleasant than the R5 or the R6. And if you are used to moving your focusing point with your thumb on the display, it's also quite uncomfortable to do on the R5C because the fan is really in your way here, and if you hold the camera from below, you really have to reach with your thumb here, and it's not as comfortable as on the R5 or the R6. So now I kind of use the joystick to select my focusing point. And when I shoot vertically, I usually have the grip facing down, but my face here will be right against the display, moving the focusing point all over the display, and it's quite a pain. So instead I have to remember to hold the camera with the grip facing up, like this, so then my nose, I guess, isn't touching the display. This never happened on my R6, and I guess if you're coming from the DSLR world and you used to have a grip below, then you must already be used to having the grip facing us. And so compared to my R6, which is here, I don't find the R5C as comfortable to shoot photo with, and I'll sometimes pack the R6 instead of the R5C. And you can really see the size difference when you hold them side by side with that fan here, and then again the viewfinder here against the viewfinder here with the fan. Another feature I sometimes miss when shooting images with the R5C is the lack of a IBIS. I've been able to shoot shutter speed as low as 1 second handheld when I paired the R6 here with the 24-70 here, which is also stabilized, which I find insane. But in the end, I think Canon made the right choice of removing the IBIS from the R5C, because IBIS isn't suited for video, and we'll talk about that later. I bought the R5C for its filmmaking capabilities. It's the second time that Canon made a derivative cinema camera from a still camera, and you may remember the 1DC announced in 2012. Hopefully Canon won't wait another 10 years to release another one after the R5C. The R5C is the new kid on the Canon cinema block, sitting right below the C70. Canon is very protective of its cinema line, and for a camera to be part of such a category, it needs to include several key features. So it creates such a strong divide between Canon cinema cameras and hybrid mirrorless, where brands such as Sony have been known to blur that line for several years now. What makes a camera a cinema camera? Is it the fact that it can shoot some sort of RAW video with a high enough dynamic range? Or the fact that it has internal ND filters? And finally, must a camera cost over $15,000 and be Netflix approved to be deemed a cinema camera? Do you even need a cinema camera to make a film? Well, that one is easy. No. We've seen it countless times since the arrival of DSLR, which could shoot 1080p movies. And we've seen documentaries selected at festivals for their quality, but also because of their prowess of being shot on, let's say, a Canon 5D Mark II, or even more recently on an iPhone. So the question is, if mirrorless and smartphones can somehow get the job done, why are we still purchasing heavy and expensive cinema cameras? Here's what I'll say, it's all about optimizations and using the proper tool for the specific job. Let's talk about painting for a second. Technically, you could paint a whole room with a square brush. It would be challenging, but the job would eventually get done. And if you're not half bad with a square brush, chances are that you could even fool your client into thinking that you used a roller brush. But now imagine how much easier it would have been with a roller brush. So it's roughly the same thing between hybrid cameras and cinema cameras. Most mirrorless cameras these days are more than capable of recording excellent videos, but at the core they are still designed to, well, take photographs. On the other hand, a cinema camera has one and only function: to record video. However, a cinema camera is so much more than simply the ability of shooting RAW with excellent dynamic range. The simple fact that the terminology is different should give you a clue. With cinema cameras, we don't talk about shutter speed, but shutter angle. There is no ISO, but there is gain, and there is no aperture, but instead iris. So all of that is just terminology, but you get the point. A cinema camera body also has a different design to suit the needs of cinematographers and camera operators, and those needs are different from the one of a photographer. Moreover, having the ability to squeeze an anamorphic lens, having access to dedicated audio and video monitoring tools, and the ability to generate timecodes are a few of the many features any cinema camera will offer by default. And are these tools mandatory to make a film? Absolutely not. But will they make your life easier on set? Hell yes! And that's what it's all about, having the proper tool for the specific job. Nowadays, people are primarily interested in dynamic range, frame rates, and what type of log format a camera can shoot. But it shouldn't be all about the K in an 8K camera. So then, is the Canon R5C a cinema camera? After all, it was inspired by a photo camera, and it can still shoot stills. That's where the term hybrids comes into play, and why Canon calls the R5C a true hybrid camera. Ironically, the controversial physical switch on top of the R5C makes all of the difference. Because when using the Canon R5C, you either take photo with an interface tailored for it, or you switch to video with an interface that brings all the tools that make shooting video easier. And so compared to previous Canon models or other camera makers that have been trying and compromising for years to merge photo and video interface into an unspeakable mess, it's a simple but elegant approach. Well, it turns out the solution all along was to keep the pig out of the horse pen, or the sheep out of the chicken coop, whatever you decide. When I shoot videos, 99% of the time I use the powerful XF AVC codec in some flavor of 4K. Not because the 8K Canon Cinema RAW light is bad, but simply because I don't have the use for 8K footage, nor the envy to purchase SSD or hard drives by pack of 20. By default, my R5C is set to 4K DCI 24p in C-Log3 in Cinema Gamut. Generally, I use long GOP for interviews and all-in for B-roll. XF AVC is such an easy codec to work with. It performs much better than the HAVC, which is H.265, and the MP4 H.264. And although you can still record in these two formats, so H.265 and H.264, I really don't see the benefits of using them. Except maybe if you decide to bake your color profile within an MP4 for broadcasting or immediate publishing. Compared to the R5, any flavor of 4K on the R5C is downsampled from a full 8K sensor readout, and it generates a beautiful and detailed image. This type of image quality reminded me of the C100 Mark II, which downsampled a 1080p output from a 4K sensor. And so when comparing the 4K video files between the R5C and my R6, you can really appreciate the level of details in the R5C file. If you switch to 120p, you can still record in 4K DCI, but the image isn't downsampled and instead use some sort of like pixel binding. And while we're on the subject of a full frame, one of my favorite features is the ability to switch between full frame and Super 35 sensor mode in 4K resolutions. This allowed me to reach further with a typical 24-70, and I found this feature particularly useful when recording an event or a documentary setup where I don't really have the time to switch lens. And if you like, you can even switch to Super 16, but this reduced the output to 2.5K, I believe. And despite sharing the same sensor, the R5C has a better dynamic range than the R5, and this is mainly due to the codec. On the paper, the R5C has a dynamic range of 14 stops. Yeah, maybe pas grand vent. It's a French expression we use in styling that means if the wind's good. And the reason why I'm saying this is that sometimes you really are wondering where those 14 stops are hiding. And this is mainly caused by the limitations of C-Log3. Because with C-Log3, believe me, those highlights are easily sent back to the moon. And while you can bring back some of those highlights in post-production, you may have to compromise between retaining the shadows or the highlights in situations where you can't really control the light. And I'm used to working with flatter images from the S-Log3 on the excellent Sony a7 III, or even the Film Gen 5 on the Blackmagic. So compared to this profile, the C-Log3 feels underwhelming. The R5C has a dual ISO of 800 and 3200, and it's the kind of feature you must try for yourself to enjoy its benefits. One good example to really notice the dual ISO is when you have focus peaking turned on, and you switch from ISO, let's say 2500 to 3200 ISO. At 2500, the focus peaking will actually overlay the noise, and it's all gone the second you reach 3200. It's also good to note that by default, the R5C has noise reduction baked in the file, and you can manually change the strength of the noise reductions in the C-Log3 settings. But I left it at the default value because they work quite well for me. When it comes to the recording times, I based them on a 512GB CF Express card Type B, so you can either double it to 1TB or divide it to 256, and you should see it on the screen anytime now. If I had to describe the overall quality of the Canon R5C video autofocus in one sentence, I would say it's hit and miss. So much can influence the quality of an autofocus. The lens, the lighting conditions, and the setting can impact how the autofocus will perform, for better and for worse. And it couldn't be more accurate when it comes to the R5C. Some days I love it, some days I just don't, and I just switch it off on the lens. And you may have heard or read that the R5C has much worse autofocus in video than the photo mode. And when comparing the R5C to its R5 brother, the R5 is much better at sticking to the subject. That's because the R5 uses a conventional photo autofocus. And while Sony has been able to design a similar autofocus that works perfectly in both stills and video, Canon has a kind of a different approach to creating autofocus depending on where it's going to be implemented, either a photo or a cinema camera, or at least that was a constantly repeat during interviews. And I get it, most users want their R5C autofocus to perform the same way whether in photo or video mode. After all, it's an hybrid camera, and while it's possible to set the AF on the video mode to mimic how it performs on the photo mode, the video AF is much more complex. It has more settings tailored for filmmakers, and resembles the AF that you have on the C70. So the idea is that depending on what you are filming, you will dial in the autofocus settings required, compared to a more set it and forget it approach that you have on the R5. On the R5C, it's all about finding a good balance between the AF frame, the AF speed, and the AF response. The autofocus setting should differ if you shoot a talking head or track a mountain bike. For example, the R5C has a face-only autofocus that will lock on your face, and if the subjects leave the frame, the autofocus won't try to hunt for the background. The other great feature is that if you are shooting several people in the same frame, the autofocus should detect all of them and then allow you to switch between each of those people by either using the control ring on your RF lens or the joystick on your R5C, and that's a great feature. And the R5C can of course still track subject across the frame by either selecting it on the touchscreen or using the joystick on the back of the R5C. In a simple environment, for example a subject on a somewhat clean background, the autofocus tracks the subject quite well and can even keep track and focus on the back of the head, not only the face. But it's when shooting in a more complex and dark environment that the autofocus can be messy. Sometimes the R5C will identify faces on other subjects such as trees. On top of that, the autofocus is much slower in lower light environments and is prone to disengage. And it's the same stories with zones of strong contrast. It will also throw off the autofocus. For example, in a forest with dappled light, or if a strong backlight is coming from a window or a fixture. To summarize, I would say to be ready to override the autofocus in dark environments, especially if you are quite confident with your focus racking. It might save your shot. I'll start by saying this: in-body image stabilization's IBIS is unsuited for cinema cameras. Mainly because you don't want your sensor to shift all over the place, creating that dreaded jello effect. Plus, if you plan to mount your camera on a car or a moving vehicle, well, the vibration would throw off the movable sensor. And finally, IBIS can create some sort of artifacts when mounting with anamorphic lenses. And so you would most likely use a Ronin, an Easy Rig, or a crane for steady shots with a cinema camera. Instead of IBIS, Canon made an updated version of their digital IS. Trust me, it's not as bad as it sounds, quite the contrary actually. Digital IS isn't new and it has been featured in Canon bodies before. It crops the images to compensate for the shake. but so far the results weren't good. However, the digital IS inside the R5C is somewhat different and produced excellent results. And I cannot state how impressed I am with the digital IS inside the R5C, especially when paired with an RF lens like the 24-70. And while it slightly crops the outputs, the stabilization is really good. Of course, it's not as effective as the IBIS on the R5 or R6, but it still significantly reduced the shake when shooting handheld. I even set the custom button 7 on top of the R5C to quickly turn off the digital IS, so it's right there at my fingertips and I don't need to dig inside the menus. The R5C has a standard 3.5 jack for the microphone input, and when plugging an external microphone it will use channel 1 and 2. And then channels 3 and 4 will record scratch audio from the internal microphone on the camera. Why 4 audio tracks then, you may ask? Well, it's for a new accessory released alongside the R5C. It's a Tascam microphone adapter that utilizes the new multi-accessory shoe on top of the camera. This $400 audio accessory has 2 XLR inputs, and it really unlocks the full potential of the R5C multi-channels. And I look at getting one of those Tascam adapters, but then I decided against it since you cannot really mount a top bundle when the Tascam is, and I hope that a manufacturer such as Small Rigs or Conner Blue would eventually come up with a solutions to use the Tascam plus a cage and a top bundle, but nothing came, so I decided not to get it. I also wish that Canon would have designed an handle with XLR and additional audio interface, like they used to do on the C100s and the C200 models. For example, what Sony did for the FX3 is brilliant because the handle also brings the input with the XLR, but it also secure with 2 extra screws on top, so it really makes that handle secure to grab the camera when your rigs becomes heavy. When using the standard 3.5 jack input for a microphone on the R5C, the results are decent but not great. The preamp is most average, especially compared to my Blackmagic Pocket. And I know there is not much room on the body, but it would have been nice to have even a mini XLR alongside the standard 3.5 jack. It's great to see a dedicated timecode port on the Canon R5C, especially since there is only one audio input on the camera, so you can still connect an external microphone while also connecting a timecode syncing device. And when it comes to port, there's also the 3.5 jack for audio monitoring, and you also find the USB-C port offering both data transfer and power delivery. It also has a port for a wireless remote and a micro HDMI input. Should it be a full-size HDMI? Absolutely. Is it a big deal? No. I mean, I just use an adapter micro HDMI to HDMI, and I secure the whole thing with a clamp on the camera cage, because I'd rather break the adapter than the port on the camera. And regardless of being a full HDMI, I would still use a clamp to secure the connections, so the micro HDMI never really bothered me. Now let's talk about the wireless situations. In short, the wireless connectivity on the R5C is a joke. There is just no other way of describing it. The Canon R5C has the same Wi-Fi and Bluetooth hardware, and in the Photo OS, it works the same way as it in the R5 or the R6. So it lets users wirelessly control the camera from a smartphone app or a wireless remote. And with the Canon iOS app, you can even download photos directly from your camera, perform updates, and more. So naturally, you would expect to have these similar features when switching to video. And while you have the right to expect it, it doesn't mean it will be there, and it's not. And you would think that the ability to change settings from an iOS app, and at the very least, press record through Bluetooth connectivity, would be a standard features in a camera released in 2022. But for some unexpected reason, Canon decided to paywall that connectivity behind a $1,000 grip specially made for the R5C. That grip has a Wi-Fi module to control your R5C from a tablet or smartphone with live preview. So the question is, if the camera can do it in the Photo OS, why can't it be doing the Video OS? Now, the following is pure speculation on my part, but I think one of the main reasons is power consumption. And when you know that in regular use the R5C goes through batteries like candies, Canon might have felt that adding a Wi-Fi feature on top of that would just drain the battery beyond control. There is no reason to beat around the bush. The autonomy of one LP6NH battery inside the R5C is terrible, plain and simple. Do not expect more than 50 minutes of recording in the standard mode, which is the XF AVC. And it gets worse when shooting RAW LT or RAW ST. On top of that, an external power source is required if you want to shoot in RAW 8K 60p, whether it's by purchasing the Canon DC adapter or connecting a power source through like the USB port like I do. And I think here we see the limitations of technology. The conventional but practical LP6NH isn't suited for shooting videos on the R5C. And since the R5C is based on the R5, Canon probably didn't want to fully redesign the body to accommodate a larger battery. Now, I knew well before I ordered what I was getting into, but I was just so impressed with the R5C capabilities that I just decided that I would just find a way of working around the power limitations. And here's how I approached the problem. Since the USB-C allows for power delivery, it even charges the battery inside the camera. Whenever I'm indoors or in a studio environment, I use one of my MacBook Pro USB chargers. It works perfectly and even enables 8K 60p, and is a far cheaper solution than buying the Canon power adapter. And if I'm on locations, I use different rigs to fit my needs. More on this later. I should also mention that at the moment, there are no dummy batteries capable of powering the R5C to shoot in 8K 60p. The R5C requires 9V of constant power. There is the Alvin's cable that has a functional dummy battery that can power the R5C up to 8K 30p with the autofocus, but no 8K 60p. Finally, Canon did release a firmware updates with a power saving features, which increase recording time in some 4K modes, but that's about it. Nevertheless, I still dream of a day where I can simply pack my R5C, one lens and maybe one extra battery and just go shoot away. But I don't think it will be possible with this particular model of the R5C. We often reproach Canon for not offering more dedicated filmmaking tools such as video and audio monitoring tools to their mirrorless. But with the R5C, Canon delivers thanks to a new dedicated video OS. The video interface is similar to those on the Canon Cinema line such as the 70 and C200s. So if you used one of those in the past, you should feel right at home. For example, I shot on the C100 Mark II for a few years, and I quickly found my mark with the R5C video menus. And I've heard complaints about reading the video interface on the small R5C display that can be hard, but this doesn't really bother me. Plus, you can send the interface via the HDMI output using an external monitor. On that subject, the menu interface is actually layered right above the video feed, which is a great feature because whether you are recording or not, you can access the camera settings. And you can fully customize what is displayed via the HDMI output and on the internal display when using an external monitors. So if you want a clean output, you can. Canon has been known to make some of the most comfortable cameras out there. And as I mentioned earlier, it is something that is often overlooked by other camera makers. One advantage of a mirrorless camera is that the lack of mirrors makes them smaller. But that doesn't mean that they're supposed to be uncomfortable to hold. The R5 and R6 have fantastic ergonomics, and the R5C isn't really far behind. But with that new fan on the back, I don't find it as comfortable as I hoped. The fan is so prominent that it's often in my way. However, the button layout is well thought, especially with the addition of 13 customizable buttons for the video features. Those are great for quickly accessing key features such as monitoring tools, autofocus settings, white balance settings, and more. Hiding buttons on a camera body is simple. However, carefully laying down controls so they can be found without looking is something else that Canon did beautifully with the R5C. For example, I used the Sony a7 III for about a year, and I never really got used to the custom buttons. But with the R5C, it quickly became second nature to switch features even without looking, because most of the controls are laid on the grip and either accessible by the index or where your thumb is. So it makes great to use the R5C when you are a solo shooter and you don't really have an AC to help you out with your camera settings. And one other advantage is when I use the R5C on my shooter rigs, because the R5C will actually be right on my side here, and I can still access all of those features because I know exactly where those buttons are and what they do. One last thing about comfort, I should mention that I leave a small rich cage 90% of the time on the camera, and it does add some bulkiness to the overall rig, but I do enjoy this hand strap here because it provides better support when holding the camera, especially with an heavy lens. And I kind of got used to those when using cinema cameras and camcorders, and it's kind of hard to forget. When looking at the promotional videos for the R5C, we follow filmmakers using the R5C to capture fast-paced sports and documentaries. The minimalist design of the R5C means it can be used without a rig and can easily be mounted on a medium-sized drone, for example. But it can also be rigged to suit standard filmmaking accessories such as an external monitors, a mat box, or a V-mount battery. And to quote Canon, the R5C is polyvalent and is ready for anything. But do you really need to rig out the R5C? Because after all, the idea behind the R5C is to be a compact 8K recorders, a perfect B-cam to mount on a car or a drone, for example. So why make it more bulky? Doesn't it defeat the purpose? Rigging cameras has been quite a trend lately, thanks to manufacturers offering affordable rigs for mirrorless cameras and small cinema cameras. Rigging your camera serves two purposes. The first one is to connect accessories to your camera, and the second one is to make your system look more professional. Because most clients will be far more impressed by a bulky camera that seems to be puking cables all over the place than a slim mirrorless camera bare of anything but a lens. However, when it comes to the R5C, rigging may be mandatory for some people to counter two issues with the R5C, the power and the lack of ND filters. I've made two different rigs for the R5C. One is minimalist and the other one is closer to a cinema rigs. And I've already made videos about them and I'll include them in the description below. But in short, I use a small rig cage, a USB-C power bank, and a set of magnetic VND filters from a minimalist rig. Whereas for the larger cinema-like rig, I use a V-mount batteries, an external display, a mat box, an external microphone, and a few other things. But after all, the R5C is still a mirrorless camera. So in theory, you shouldn't need to mount bulky accessories to shoot some video when backpacking in the mountains, right? If you take a look at the video, The Soul of Madeira, we follow a filmmaker shooting a documentary with his R5C. From lush forest to rugged coast, the filmmakers use his compact R5C, sometimes mounting it on a FPV drone or on a gimbal. And he shows how versatile the R5C can be, switching between RF and cine lenses. And of course, it's an advertising video, so its primary purpose is to excite us about the capabilities of such a compact mirrorless. Here's the thing though, you see that bag? It's your typical camera bag. We all have at least one. The thing is about that bag that it must be filled to the top with LP6NH batteries, because we don't see him use external powers once. And why does it matter? Because unless you carry over 50 of those batteries, which cost $129 by the way, there is simply no way to perform a day shoot without an external source of powers with the R5C. Overall, the Canon R5C found an audience, which means that Canon most likely will update it to a Mark II in a year or two. And we've already heard rumors about it, and we've also seen patents for internal ND technology inside EOS R body, so that's quite interesting. An R5C Mark II featuring internal NDs and a different power source could be a bestseller. And while we're on the list of hardware changes, I would love to see at least one mini XLR, a full-size HDMI event, and why not even dream further and think of a global shutter? That'd be nice. But it's not all about the hardware. There are several things that Canon could fix on the actual R5C through software updates, starting with adding support for C-Log 2. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised if Canon never brings C-Log 2 to the R5C, and instead kind of keep it as an extra features for the upcoming model. Because when looking at the dynamic range charts, the R5C has nothing to be shy about, and it will perform even better with the failure curve of C-Log 2. Now, I am probably one of the very few who actually enjoy the two separate OS. However, the fact that you cannot shoot photos in the video mode and cannot record video in the photo mode can be quite frustrating. You can grab an actual still from the video mode, but it comes from the video file, so you have the C-Log 3 curve, and it isn't a RAW file. So it would be great to have the ability to set a video format in the video OS that could be used inside the photo OS. Pushing one button will record a video clip based on the preset settings that you chose in the video OS. It's available on the R5 and it's pretty handy. And the same thing applies when using the R5C for video. I would most welcome the ability to shoot a RAW photo with automatic settings. Another thing that I don't quite understand in the video mode is that the primary wheel here on the back is disabled. It would be great to set a function to this wheel, for example to set the white balance. I would be lying if I said that the marketing for the R5C didn't influence my choice of getting the R5C over the R5. And while Canon messed up real good the R5 marketing campaign, they did much better with the R5C. They really pounded the ability to shoot unlimited videos thanks to the new fan and also the ability to shoot 8K 60p. And at first that really sounded like a mea culpa for the overheating issues on the R5 and the R6. But one message was clear, is that it's a cinema cameras for filmmakers who mainly shoot videos but also wants to capture excellent stills. Canon states that the R5C is the perfect camera for filmmakers, event videographers, multimedia journalists, and advanced amateurs. It's also the entry level to the Canon cinema line, sitting right below the C7G. And having a dedicated video mode means that the R5C is also great as a B-cam. On my hand, I would recommend the R5C to people who know that they'll be shooting more video than stills. As mentioned earlier, the R5C takes excellent images. However, I don't find it as comfortable as the R5s, and it doesn't have the IBIS, which is great for photos but not suitable for filmmaking. Now, let's say that you have a Canon R5, R6 or R7 and you find that you shoot more video than photo, but you still want the ability to shoot stills, and you also wish that you had more dedicated filmmaking tools. Well, then the R5C might be your entry ticket into the world of cinema cameras without breaking the bank. As of November 2023, the R5C can be found new for $3,799 or $5,499 in Canada, thanks to how crappy the Canadian dollar is. Regardless, I think it's worth every penny, and no other camera at the moment can offer all of the R5C features at that price range. Remember that for less than $4,000, you have an all-in-one camera with a 45 megapixel sensor and the ability to shoot 8K up to 60p unlimited recording, as long as you have also a Pelican case full of batteries and CF Card Express, of course. So would I recommend purchasing it in December 2023, knowing that the R5C Mark II is most likely in the works? Well, if you know you're going to be very busy for the next 4 months, yes. However, if you think that your current system can hold, then maybe wait a little bit longer, because Canon hasn't released a single cinema camera in 2023, and we know they're working on several new cinema cameras to be released next year. So after a year and a half, the honeymoon is over, but I still truly love my R5C. Yes, it's not perfect, but what or who is? I found ways to work around the power issues and the lack of ND filters, and I truly enjoy that all-in-one package. Because for once, Canon didn't compromise on dedicated filmmaking tools for at least one of their mirrorless cameras. And it's all the simple things that make this camera great, like the shutter angles, no more forgetting to change your shutter speed when you're switching frame rates, and having false colors or waveforms that don't disappear when you press record. The R5C rekindles the abandoned legacy left by the 1DC and proves that there is a market for compact true hybrid cinema cameras. And I'm sure there is more to come from Canon on that front. And this time, it shouldn't take them 10 years to get their ducks in a row. That's for me, guys. Thank you for watching this extensive review of the Canon R5C. If you made it to the end, well, congratulations and thank you. And if you got something out of it, please consider liking and subscribing so I can do more of those videos in the future. Bye for now.